Welcome to Global Eye Intelligence and welcome to the West Asia Tracker, your go to podcast for an in depth analysis and insights into one of the world's most dynamic and complex regions. I am your host Sumedh Desai, bringing you the latest developments, strategic trends, and critical stories shaping West Asia. In today's episode, we are joined by two very talented young guys from Upijindal who have been interning with us and have worked on Syria, West Asia, and majorly on the terrorist groups around the world. In today's episode, we'll dive deep into Syria, exploring its implications for the region and beyond. So, welcome Shantanu, welcome Taavish. We'll start with your initial thoughts on the developments in Syria. So, first we'll go to Shantanu and then it will be followed up by Tavish. Shantanu, your first thoughts on Syria.
Basically, the situation around Syria started at around 2011 when officially the Syrian civil war started. Basically, fought against the Assad regime by the so-called popular movement inside Syria. Situation in Syria is a very dynamic, a very weird situation considering its history and its secular past. So currently, at this point of stage, the Islamic resistance has grew, or rather has increased in the situation of Syrian rebels as well as some Syrian terrorist Islamic groups. Starting with that in 2011, when Assad regime purportedly released some prisoners from their jails in order to accommodate other terrorists inside the jail. These prisoners who were increasingly radicalized came into the influence of Al Qaeda, and that's how it gave birth to the Al Nusra Front. So the situation around Al Nusra Front was tense, and it kind of is an offshoot group of Al Qaeda and ISIS members who were having some troubles with the hierarchy of ISIS and Al Qaeda. So basic difference between Al Nusra Front and Al Qaeda is that Al Nusra specifically and only focuses on Syria, whereas Al Qaeda and ISIS had their global outreach. But they wanted the Al Qaeda members, the other Al Qaeda members, from Syria especially, to fight other battles as well. Whereas the Al Nusra members who were from Syria and Iraq and were Sunnis wanted to fight only for Syria's sake and to oust the Assad regime. And that's how the complexity around the civil war started.
So, in your initial thoughts, you just demarcated the difference between global jihad and the fight that the Syrian
Yeah,
rebels have been fighting, that is for the national statehood.
right.
Good point to start with. We'll go to Tavish next.
Yeah, I think it's important to analyze it also from the lens of how the Sykes-Picot Treaty in 19 after World War One, when the British and French basically partitioned the Middle East according to their interests and not according to the tribes, the ethnicities, the different religious groups in the region, were all clubbed together into different countries that didn't particularly make any sense. So in that context, if you look at Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, a lot of these countries, they don't have any shared identity, any shared principles, or any shared history. You've got Sunnis, Shias, Yazidi, Kurdish people, different ethnicities all clubbed together into one country, and oftentimes it manifests itself into one secular dictatorship, needing to unite all of these different tribes together. And in 2011, what we saw was that it reached a tipping point where a lot of these dictatorships in the Middle East and in West Asia and North Africa were basically toppled in the Arab Spring movement because they were fed up with the system of governance at the time. Also, there was a lot of meddling happening from Western governments as well because they have their own interests in the region. Up until now, the Syrian government, the Assad regime, was being upheld in large part due to Iranian support and then also the Russian military support, especially in 2014 when the Russians went in and basically obliterated Aleppo, the city of Aleppo, in favor of the Assad regime to basically oust ISIS. But in recent years, because of the fact that Russia has been occupied in Ukraine and they have other geopolitical interests elsewhere, there has been a sort of power vacuum that has built up. And this time the rebels got the better of the Assad regime. They also had the momentum and the support of Islamic terrorist organizations, jihadists, and other extremists. So it was a combination of various different actors coming together to topple this regime, and it succeeded. It works in collaboration with the Iranian regime's set of proxies, like whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon or whether it's the Assad regime in Syria itself. A lot of that support and that network has basically been broken up ever since Israel went to war with Hamas in 2023. So it's sort of the many different actors getting involved in this. On behalf of the protesters and on behalf of the terrorists who wanted to topple Assad regime, you also had the Turkish who were supporting it because they have also been very anti Assad. So there are many different actors who are contributing towards this, and that's why you've seen this regime topple.
Well, on the current developments. Now we'll focus on country-wise and country-wise interests and how they are, challenging the dynamics of Syria. So we'll start with Turkey. We know that Trump has said that Turkey has enabled a hostile takeover of Syria because somewhere we understood that Turkey was in favor of a dialogue on the Syrian issue, on the Syrian political settlement. As was called the Astana format, where you had the Russians, the Iranians, and the Turks mediating with the Syrian government as to build a political consensus with the opposition groups that controlled vast parts of the territory. But Turkey fell out of that deal, of that format. Turkey was interested with the in negotiating with the Syrian government, with the Assad regime, up late till 2024. But when it sensed that Russia was occupied in Ukraine, Iran was weakened because of the dismantling of its resistance groups around the region. It tried to take advantage of the situation before Trump could come back to the White House, and supported uh, the rebel groups, primarily the HTS, as we know, Hayat al Tahrir Sham, and they have already been supporting the new regime in Syria in lobbying for the Arab support. So we have seen that the Syrian foreign minister has visited UAE, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and they have been well backed off by Turkey at international and regional platforms. So, your initial thoughts on Turkey? We'll start with Tavish and then we'll go to Shantanu.
So I think that Turkey's also got its own hand to play in this game because they are very anti-Kurdish and they oppose the creation of Kurdistan, and there is a massive Kurdish presence in northern Syria. And so for them, they see a destabilized Syria as advantageous for them so that they can, one, resist Kurdish separatism, but then also be able to use Syria to pursue their own geopolitical ambitions. They are also vehemently anti-Israel, and Israel also has got a stake in Syria when it comes to the Golan Heights, which were acquired by the Israelis during the first Trump administration. And so for them, they have many different angles through which they can leverage their interests. And one of them is primarily to counter Israel. The other one is also to limit Kurdish influence in the region and or either decimate them entirely. So for them, they have a strong hand to play when it comes to supporting these rebels and in some cases even some of these jihadist organizations. But more importantly, I think that the split will also come when we look at it through the lens of that they are a member of NATO, and so nominally they should be on the same page as the US. But they're also very anti-Israel, and the US will have to balance its interests out over here and determine whether or not it will go, whether it's supposed to back the NATO ally or whether or not it is supposed to back its primary ally Israel. And so it's going to be a contest between these two powers and how they carve out Syria according to their interests. But right now, for the biggest beneficiary of this, of the collapse of the Assad regime, has been the Turkish government, and by their own means, they are probably the biggest superpower in the region when it comes to military power, when it comes to their drone technology, when it comes to their ability to actually project their air force and all of that. They're far superior to any other power in the region. So yeah, they've stood to benefit the most.
Your thoughts on this, Shantanu?
Specifically, Turkey. It's a very different situation from Turkey. Reason being, we had to go back in time during the World War One era, as the fall of Ottoman Empire ensured that all these regions, which were once a part of Ottoman Empire, starting from Mecca all the way to Syria and Lebanon, all these areas were once part of the Ottoman Empire, and it was a hard pill to swallow for the Turkish people to lose all these areas. First of all, and how later on these were converted into mandate systems under Syria, under English, British, and the French rule. Starting from that point of time itself, they had to sign something called as a national pact, which kind of made them compelled them to not claim these areas in future, which were once part of the Ottoman Empire back then. At that time, Kemal Pasha was a ruler, and he kind of agreed with it. But as soon as a little bit of radicalism emerged in the 60s in Turkey, the National Pact was condemned by the Turkish people, saying that we don't accept it. We need more and more area. We need more influence on other areas around Turkey. The Kurdish angle is a whole different thing. Yeah, they do resist the Kurds in this particular area, and northern Syria is dominated by the Kurds. That's the reason why they have captured the M4 highway, which connects Iran all the way to the Mediterranean coast. And by capturing that, they have successfully stopped Iranian trade to the Mediterranean ports and to Europe subsequently. Followed by that, Turkey wants to see itself as a leader of the Islamic world. Today, it is at a position where it can actually influence the Islamic world because they have money, they have defense, they have a good drone and UAV systems which no other country possesses at this moment. All these things are something which makes Turkey kind of a regional hegemon in that particular region. Followed by that, we can also see that in Syria as well, they are also involved in Cyprus. Followed by that, they are supporting Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, and they successfully countered Russian and Armenian influences in that particular region. And you can also say that it's their own quest to reclaim these regions which were once the part of the Ottoman Empire, and that's how they are influencing and kind of intervening in these particular areas. Followed by the diaspora around the world, especially in Europe, which is supporting this particular cause, and the amount of donations and the money they get from the Hawala networks and how they influence them by giving them some weapons, UAV weapons and stuff. Yeah, Turkey has its own piece to play here, and I guess they're playing it really well. And in this particular 4 years of Biden's regime, I think that after Israel, Turkey is the one which is the winner.
One point that we all missed out when it comes to Turkey and Syria is the refugees. The refugees has been a very important point within the political circles of Turkey, and it has been a very contested domestic issue in Turkish politics. The new regime in Syria has guaranteed that it will create and enable conditions for the safe return of all the Syrian refugees who fled to Turkey. Thereby, the talks are being assured by the new regime that if the talks can mobilize some financial resources, humanitarian aid, and lobby to the Americans to remove sanctions or to ease out on sanctions, it will help and facilitate the process of return of refugees back to Syria. So this is again a very important part where the Turks are helping the Syrians. Now let's get to Syria. Now let's get to Israel. Sorry, I think Israel has been the most important winner out of this entire episode, because at the end of the day, Israel had its eyes on Gaza and Lebanon. These two territories, however, they did an ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which wherein they kind of agreed for a phased withdrawal of IDF from Lebanon. But they got a very good opportunity, and that opportunity translated into more land, more Syrian land. So they occupied a lot of Syrian land. They occupied strategic positions like the Mount Hermon. They are literally like 20 kilometers or 12-15 miles away from Damascus. So, and they are at a very strategic position as well to control the new Syrian regime. Plus, they have bombed all the military sites, all small manufacturing arms factories and industries around the Syrian territory, which Assad controlled. So basically, they have forcefully demilitarized Syria as to make sure that the new regime does not pose a threat to the Israelis. Initial thoughts on Israel, and how do you think the Israelis benefit from any kind of sectarian war in Israel? So we'll start with Shantanu and we'll go next to Taavish.
Regarding Israel, that it is the biggest winner in this particular battle. Yeah, it definitely is the biggest winner. Starting with Israel, it's like they have a concept called a Greater Israel, where they aim to capture more and more areas which were once mentioned in their Torah and Bible. Followed by that, their own perspective on this particular thought, or rather the particular event, or rather it's my own perspective. It feels as if once the Syrian rebels and the HTS groups, they have successfully countered Assad regime right now. So once this particular battle has ended, there are no other enemy left than Israel. And Israel is at such a situation that it is trying to be volatile, and it is volatile, absolutely yes. And it is trying to get inroads into the Islamic thought, basically questioning it and kind of inducing the sectarian violence. Uh, Basically, Iran is accusing Israel, or rather, all other Islamic countries are accusing Israel for, instigating the sectarian violence in these particular areas. Because in Syria, if you see, around 30 to 40% are Shias and the rest are Sunnis, and there are some factions of Alawites and Maronites. Same goes with Lebanon as well. But the problem is that it's difficult to draw a nexus over here, like who is supporting whom. Because in the end, when it comes to their own battles, Shias and Sunnis are not supporting each other, but while fighting Israel, they do sometimes. But if you see in Syria itself, it was Hezbollah and Assad regime fighting fighting the HTS and other Free Syrian Army groups. Whereas Hezbollah itself is a Shiite group. Whereas if you see in Israel's case, in Gaza's case, Hamas is a Sunni group. It's backed by Iran. So it's difficult to draw the nexus, like who is supporting whom. And Israel at this point, looking at the what we say a kind of a gap, or rather what we say gap or rather normal place wherein they have an opportunity to advance at this point. The new Syrian regime is trying to stabilize itself at first, and they are trying to accommodate all the areas which they have captured. Looking at this particular side, at the southern side, southwest side, where Israel has captured the Golan Heights area long back, they're trying to enter again more and more area, because they know that the Syrian army cannot have that amount of resources and military will to fight against Israel at this point. And that's the reason why they are fighting. They're trying to gain and secure more and more areas so that it will be easier for Israel to defend itself when it comes to an offensive launched by the Free Syrian army in future. They're just trying to, what do we say, pretext. It's like it's a pretext they have gotten to stop it at this point itself, because it will be difficult in future if they have not advanced even more, and rather if they just have their borders at the Golan Heights, it would be easier for the Free Syrian army, or rather a huge army, a coalition army, to enter Israel. So they're just trying to defend themselves by launching a preemptive airstrikes, preemptive military operations to nullify the effects in future. That's all I can say right now.
Basically, to create or to extend the strategic buffer
Yeah.
that was created after 1967 war, and it was monitored by the UN. But now they think that the UN has failed its duty when it comes to UNIFIL or in Syria as well. So they are trying to extend the strategic buffer
They're
without
trying to
any
exploit
international.
the United Nations own laws at this point.
And the UN has considerably failed on Syria because the UN
Yeah.
has got itself up into a very jumbled position as to which side to choose, because Syria has been a victim of great power politics. So, what are your thoughts on this, Tavish, on Israel?
Yeah, I think it's mostly true about the fact that Israel basically has ideological goals to this, wherein they want to establish a greater Israel, which is rooted in biblical origins and of that sort. But then it's also a part of just great power politics, where they want to be able to create a sort of buffer zone. I mean, during World War II, the Germans had a concept called Lebensraum, which translates to living space, which essentially details out a certain area called a certain area which would be considered like a breathing room for any superpower to have, so that they can protect themselves from a potential invasion but then also be able to project their power elsewhere. And so what Israel is essentially trying to do is to create that sort of buffer zone around Israel, because on one side you've got the ocean, on the other side you're dealing with a number of powers that are antagonistic or straight up hostile towards Israel. And so they are looking to essentially carve out all those regions that could potentially become a threat in the future. So in this case, Syria is one of the number one positions that can affect the Israeli government and the Israeli population, and so they're going to utilize that to its maximum potential. They are also having to take out the proxies of the Iranian regime, because the Iranian regime is their number one enemy right now. But then it could also be Turkey in a few years from now. And so in order to prevent any one of these powers from acquiring too much control of these regions, they need to project their power right now, and they're doing that by taking out Hezbollah, by taking out Hamas, by taking out the Houthis in the Red Sea, and then also now facilitating the toppling of this regime, and then also taking more territory. So for them it is partly ideological, but then mostly also just a measure of security that they are pursuing.
Wonderful. Let's analyze the Russian and Iranian partnership in Syria. Because Syria was in a time a cornerstone behind the Russian Iranian strategic partnership. Whatever happened in Syria kind of gave the impetus to the Russians and the Iranians to coordinate, cooperate, and keep growing their partnership. Now that we are in a fix where the Russians are being accused by the Iranians of, giving up on the Assad regime or selling out the Assad regime by not trying to defend it. We saw that Russia tried to bombard the rebel advance towards Damascus in the final days of the Assad regime. But the Iranians are accusing the Russians that they just bombed empty fields and it was an act of deception. So, how do you assess the limitations of Russia Iran strategic partnerships with regards to Syria? We'll start with Tavish and then we'll move to Shantanu.
Yeah, I think for the most part it is very limited, for the main reason being that Russia is completely occupied in Ukraine and that their special military operation is not going as planned over there, and that they are getting stalled and they're not being able to achieve their outcomes easily. And because of that, massive power vacuum has been formed all across West Asia, even in the Caucasus and other parts of the world. So for them to be able to commit their troops towards upholding the Assad regime was never a possibility. But then also working with Iran was also not going to be able to manifest itself for various reasons. Also, the fact that the Iranian regime is also going to most likely be put under some of the most draconian sanctions by the Trump administration. And so, for Iran, the way they are going to see this is that they've had a few back and forths with the Israelis, where the Israelis have attacked them, they've attacked them back. A lot of it has mostly been symbolic, in the sense that none of them have actually achieved any real geopolitical wins in that sense. But for the Iranians, this moment is going to be an important one when it comes to the Assad regime in particular.
Your thoughts on this, Shantanu?
Well, Iran, Russia, and Syrian nexus, I can say only one thing, that these three entities over a period of time has failed because we can see that their own regime has been toppled and there is a new regime under the new Syrian regime per se. Regarding Russia and Iran, they have their one common enemy, that is United States, which is supporting the rebels by supporting them through weapons and through money. By doing this, we can go back again in time where Soviet Union kind of helped the first Assad regime to come into power, which was later on carried forward even today and to his son Bashar al. Yeah, so historical context is present at this point, and even today we can see that Russia and Syria. I mean, Iran did accuse Russia for not helping them because I guess Russia was already getting some level of offensive in Ukraine because Ukraine also regrouped its forces and was trying to re-enter into the Kursk region. And followed by that, I mean, Iran had some logistical issues when it comes to the M4 highway, which was also used for sending weapons to the Kurdish militants in that area, which kind of made them into a deadlock. And as I had mentioned before, the nexus is has many loopholes and many small border lines, some issues which they have it among themselves. Also, in the case of the HTS group and the Free Syrian Army, same case is over here as well. Both of them blaming each other. But in the end, it's the new Syrian regime, which came out to be the winner.
Now, before wrapping up the wonderful conversation, we'll just touch upon the Americans one last time. So, in 2024, when the entire world was tracing the American presence in West Asia, we knew that there were around 900 troops stationed in Syria. But the new congressional report suggests that there are around 2,000 American troops, boots on ground in Syria, which kind of brings us to an assumption that, the Americans expect more volatility in Syria and that's why they've boosted their military presence. So, how do you see the revival of ISIS and the fight against ISIS by the Americans in this scenario? We'll start with Shantanu and we'll end at Tavish.
Well, in the case of ISIS and United States basically, I mean, it's the highest and the biggest weapon exporting country in the world. Again, it's my theory that the world itself today, the P5 members don't want peace around the world because if that's the case, then who will buy the weapons? So we have these huge companies like Lockheed Martin, which lobbies the United States and their own Congress, which kind of compels them to get involved in all the situations around the world. So you can see today United States is involved in almost all the global conflicts, whether it's in Panama, whether it's in Indonesia, in Syria, in Israel, everywhere they are involved. Basically, United States just wants to be the player actor. They want to pose themselves that I am relevant, even though it has reduced comparatively in the last 4 years. Followed by that, I think United States needs to understand that uh, they are no longer the what we say. It's not no longer a unipolar world run by them. There are other multiple actors which have entered the room. It's China, it's Turkey, and even Russia is relatively stronger. Coming back to the main point, I mean, again, as I mentioned, the role of ISIS. Yeah, I mean, these particular groups which were fighting against ISIS were supported by United States. So back then, when al-Baghdadi was assassinated, when he was bombed out by the Trump regime, he was supported by many other regional factions and terrorist groups inside Syria and Iraq, right? But today, if we see, ISIS has kind of re-emerged itself, has rebranded itself, not only in Syria and Iraq, but also in other parts of the world, especially in Afghanistan, Khorasan province, and even in Southeast Asia. So today we can see that the amount of help given to the rebels by the United States, the same amount of help, some factions which emerged out of it had gone out with ISIS and Al Qaeda, and these particular groups using that amount of money which has been gained from the loot conquered from Taliban during back then, and even from the other bombings conducted by these particular regimes in Syria and Iraq. And that's how, I mean, it has helped them to, regain its forces and to attack the United States itself by the end. Because in the end, for these particular rebel groups or these terrorist groups, any other non-Muslim is a kafir. And that's how, in the end, when the work is done, they will not wait to fight against you as well. That's the theory. Thank you.
Your concluding remarks, Tavish.
Yeah, I think that it's clear that because the Americans, we have historical precedents of them getting involved in West Asia, especially when it came to Iraq in 2003, which was a part of their broader war on terrorism. They're not afraid to go inside when it comes to these issues, when it comes to dealing with security threats. And at the time, it was believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and that he posed a threat to Israel, which is their number one ally. They got involved in this war and went and toppled his regime. The only difference from that time to now is the fact that we're dealing with an America which is far more populist in nature and that is far more isolationist. Trump is not someone that is very committed towards endless foreign wars, and it was part of his campaign pitch initially. So it will also be a battle within the Republican Party right now in this next term as to whether or not Trump is going to pursue a very hawkish foreign policy or not. Right now, the belief is that he is going to pursue regime change in Iran to topple Khamenei Soleimani because of the fact that he poses a threat to Israel, but then also America at large because he is in a war against the West in general. So for America, it is going to be a balance between that, whether they leave the situation as is, whether they take a step back and decide that they're not going to get involved, or else they actively get involved and participate in this war. But there are other actors also in the game, like people like Saudi Arabia, who also have vested interest in toppling the Iranians. You also have the Russians who are going to try to attempt to thwart as much American influence as they can to the extent that they can, but it's unlikely to ever happen. So, as I said, like the Americans will have to balance out a series of different actors who want pit themselves against one another. And in this case, I think the most important will be the Turkish and Israeli question, because on the one hand, Turkey is a member of NATO, and any war against a member of NATO means that they need to come to their defense. But then at the same time, if Turkey goes to war with Israel, and Erdogan has made it abundantly clear that he's willing to do something like that, or over the Palestine question, it'll then become a very tough situation for the Americans because they will also have to back the Israelis. So for them to manage their own internal dilemma, which is Western countries, and then also deal with external threats like Iran, and then also jihadist organizations like ISIS, it shows that America will, to some extent, need to be involved. But to what extent will be the big question, because as I've said, Trump is a far more isolationist figure. His foreign policy cabinet is entirely filled with isolationists like Tulsi Gabbard, who was at one point considered one of the Assad toadies, or someone who's very chummy with Assad. So it will be a very difficult question within the Republican Party. So I think it will be an indictment on their current politics and how they are evolving as a nation. But then I do believe that at the end of the day, they are going to be very aggressive when it comes to Iran, and they will back the Israeli government in this issue. I don't think Israel is particularly happy about the developments in Syria because the people that have come into power are not particularly pro-Israel. They're not exactly very fond of Jewish people in that sense. They are anti-Semitic. They are jihadists. So it'll be a difficult question, but I think I do believe that the Americans will take a strong foot and they will charge into the Middle East.
Thank you. It was a wonderful conversation. We touched upon a lot of points, and I hope both of you enjoyed discussing Syria. We'll leave the rest to our viewers, to our listeners, who will express their own thoughts on this discussion and let us know. So, thank you, Shantanu, and thank you, Tavish, for joining.
Thank you.